Recently I made a video talking about Death Battle and its scaling, which performed relatively well, no doubt because I had a big YouTube channel in both the title and the thumbnail. As a result I got a lot of comments, and of course the comments that you would expect to see in internet discourse are quite toxic, but I was quite surprised with the civility of the disagreements presented in my video. Many of the points presented did interest me with making a follow-up video, partly because I feel as though I agree with some of the points, but also because I feel like I could explain it better than in my original video, but of course there are also some points that I disagree with. I am of course also not going to reply to every single comment on the video because that is just there's a lot of comments and it would take too much time to do that, but also a lot of the comments were saying the same thing, so by making this video I hope to fully articulate my thoughts and the general notions said by these people. It's also going to be a very highly edited video at all. It's mostly just going to be me yapping, so kind of filler, but you know, I want to make this video. There are three comments in particular I want to look at, as they are the people who decided to give the most lengthy responses to the video, and as a result, most other critiques are already covered by these longer comments. So if you're someone who left a comment on the video, you probably won't get a direct response, but I'll still answer the questions and critiques that I think matter most, which are pirated the most. So let's go through each part of each comment and talk about it. How do you change profiles? First point is, while I do agree with the King Vegeta feat criticism, you can scale Omni-Man's spread to Universa, considering the statements about Viltrumites and more. Death Battle and your video have that statement in the right corner when speed brought up. Admittedly, this is something I should have mentioned in my original video. I initially didn't because it's partially a mistake, but also because it wasn't the main scaling used in the Death Battle video for Omni-Man. Regardless, if you do use the Universa feat that they mentioned, that actually does change some things, as it would only make Super Saiyan Bardock around 4 times faster than Omni-Man, meaning that in terms of comparing their strength, Omni-Man would definitely win with these stats. The problem is that this feat is not mentioned in the video itself, aside from the black box, which is very easy to miss. While that obviously doesn't make it invalid, it's clearly not something that Death Battle themselves fully bought, at least not in my view. Just as Bardock could be scaled higher with Death Battle's logic using the black boxes, they didn't use it for the main part of the Death Battle, which I think is another reason why I think the Death Battle research should be made public. And if they did buy that Omni-Man was just as fast as the Universa feat, then I don't see why they couldn't have just brought it up. According to Death Battle, Bardock is faster, but Omni-Man was stronger, so Omni-Man won. But while it would have been consistent for Universa's feat to be directly compared to where they have Bardock's speed, it all of a sudden doesn't become consistent when you consider that, again, the difference between Bardock and Omni-Man's speed is over 20,000 times without the Universa feat. It just causes needless confusion and contention in my opinion. The second point brought up is that Death Battle says they always analyse the character at max potential. It would be super unfair if Miles killed Deku before Gear Shift. And then later, again, you even said in the video you're aware of the black boxes holding other info, which you would want them to actually say, but the info is there and it gives an explanation, so I don't see the issue because the info is there. Now, I don't mean to disrespect this commenter, because they were quite respectful to me. However, I did notice that this particular critique is worded quite specifically, saying that Death Battle used characters at, quote, their full potential. As I understood it, as well as many of the other comments understood it, the rule is that Death Battle allows their combatants to use their final and most powerful forms, even if they would lose before that could happen. And Gear Shift isn't a transformation. Sure, it amplifies Deku's speed, but it's a technique, it's a quirk. And while I could grant the notion that that should count for Deku, it does open yourself up to a massive grey area where you have to count techniques and abilities which are not distinctly transformations in my opinion. Because sure, it might be fitting in this scenario, but do we then cover or allow any character that has a technique which allows them to increase their speed if they're able to do that, even if their base speed is far too slow by comparison to the opponent? That doesn't seem quite right to me, again in my opinion. The second point this commenter brings up is something that they already mentioned and I wanted to say in the video itself, referring to the black box in the top right, so there really isn't much of a problem. On some level, I do understand, as one of my main points is that Death Battle needs to explain their outcomes more succinctly. Because, as I said at the end of the video, Death Battle could be completely consistent with their own logic and scaling, and I just didn't get it or it didn't come across to me that way. And simply saying that Death Battle has a small box in the top right hand of the corner of a screen for a few seconds doesn't quite really cut it for me. Could you imagine if Master Chief had a specific way he could have beat Doomslayer, but due to other factors, instead of explaining in the video why that wouldn't work, Death Battle just had a black box in the top right hand corner for a few seconds explaining it? I think you get the point by now, it just should be better explained. The third point outlines that Death Battle did mention, at least to some capacity, that Ghost Rider is weak to holy weaponry, which Spawn has access to. That Death Battle also said the Penance Stare wouldn't work on Spawn, and Ghost Rider couldn't overcome the soul manipulating abilities that Spawn has. This is something I'm not quite convinced by, at least with the holy weapon point. As a certain comedy YouTuber who makes videos about DC characters once said, just because you have a weakness doesn't mean it's going to mean anything in a fight. More specifically, if that weakness can't be exploited. Maybe I'm jumping the gun here, but I don't think someone who is infinitely lower than someone else can realistically do any physical damage to them, even if they exploit an otherwise would-be weakness. If a hypothetical two-dimensional being shot a two-dimensional gun at me, just because I am weak to gunfire in real life, it doesn't mean that that infinitely lower being who has the same thing which could harm me would do so. Particularly because Death Battle calls it a weakness and not something that would instantly kill the Ghost Rider in one hit as well. The commenter themselves did mention that Death Battle should have explained this better, to be fair, and while sure Death Battle did mention the Penance Stare wouldn't work on Spawn, it's not like that was really the point of my criticism. The last point that this commenter made is that in the animation post-fight analysis and rundown, they explained that Kyle could absorb Kyle's energy, doing what he did similarly in the Labyrinth, essentially giving him a 12.3 dimensional boost again. What's really weird to me is you said you heard them say power absorption. They also reasonably, and since Kyle couldn't kill him with his ring, he would low on charge, and they bring up probability altering missiles during the imagination section, so obviously that was to show creativity. First, I'm going to presume that there was a typo in saying Simone could absorb Kyle's energy, but if this was the point that Death Battle was making, then it really should have been expressed better, because simply saying that Simone can absorb Kyle's power doesn't immediately say to me that he could absorb all of Kyle's power, especially considering said power is beyond infinitely greater than he is. It is also true that Death Battle did bring up the probability altering missiles during the imagination section, but that wasn't really a point for Simone. The reason it was brought up was to say that Kyle could easily deal with something like that despite not having encountered it before. I did also see people talk about in the comments about the imagination section, and that what Death Battle really meant was talking about the abilities of Simone and Kyle, and with that context that does work, but I think it would be perfectly reasonable for someone to say to Death Battle, why did you call it imagination instead of abilities? It's not as if the term abilities is particularly vague, and there's giving leniency and then there's giving leniency to the point of an unreasonable degree. When Death Battle said the word imagination, was I supposed to assume that they actually meant was abilities? The final part of this commenter's comment was talking about that Death Battle does have some questions and answers live streams for paid members to talk about the episode. While I do think this is a great idea to have, I also don't think you should have to pay in order to get a chance to see the thoughts and reasonings behind they have for the episodes. Also, to change your profile picture, you tap on your profile picture, tap on the channel, tap edit, tap on your profile picture, select a picture and then press save. Hope this helps. The next long comment comes from Night Ninja 47. Their first point is the longest, which goes as follows. I think the best way to explain what Death Battle does is that they look at things less implicitly. What that means is if we say DC has an infinite dimensional cosmology and Kyle and Hal somewhere scale to the infinite level, but generally Hal is more powerful despite this, then the way to separate it is to say by how many infinite layers. Since Kyle's comic panel directly lists him as scaling to 12.3 infinite dimensions as a Green Lantern, and that is the highest direct statement that he has, that's what they go with so long as it fits his character and is somewhat consistent. This also works if you look at similar episodes like Raven vs. Phoenix. Both are infinite in their worlds, but their characters are stronger than both by several leagues of above characters who are infinity. I am butchering this, I'm really sorry. But because power wasn't the reason either one, they don't need to give a number because it cancels out. That or such numbers aren't given for comparison. So to explain away your episode examples, Kyle can't beat Simone because while he is more powerful, Simone's informational regeneration is something that his power can't overcome. No matter how hard he hits him, even if it's an infinite blow, he can't destroy information. Then Simone would just come back stronger. I am not completely convinced by this. While I think it is cooler to have a specific character have a feat or statement on their own rather than chain scaling to 100 different characters, I don't think that should then automatically means that should be how we define their scaling, especially when they're shown to be really strong by comparison to other characters. I do get what you're saying about different levels of infinity and to distinguish them, but keep in mind that Death Battle not only had Kyle Rayner at 12.3 dimensional, but DC's multiversal cosmology at that level as well.
Or hold back a 12.3 dimensional Big Bang. Wait, 0.3? DC's multiverse has 12.3 dimensions? That is the stupidest thing I've ever heard.
So the claim is a bit different in my view. I should also mention this now because this is by far the most common comment I got about Simone versus Kyle. And it's that Kyle, even if he's infinitely stronger, cannot kill someone who can regenerate on an informational level. That could very well be true. I haven't read any Kyle Rayner comics, I don't know if he can do that. My point wasn't that Kyle can't overcome Simone's regeneration, it was because I felt like Death Battle should have explained how that happens more thoroughly because Kyle is infinitely stronger. Death Battle went out of their way to explain dimensionality and what it means to transcendently be stronger than something else, to presumably appease a more casual audience who doesn't understand what that means. So I find it bizarre they didn't have at least a part of the video explaining why the fact that Kyle was infinitely stronger didn't matter, and instead just glossed over it. People also said this for Spawn vs Ghost Rider, and I would simply say the same thing. The last main point of interest this commenter makes is Omni-Man's solar disk feat was listed as higher than the planet feat. Bardock blitzing doesn't do anything. He doesn't have enough firepower to do enough damage, and with them saying he can't use Super Saiyan as long as Goku, which is a form that gives him the best odds, he can't hit Nolan hard enough to win. This is something I firmly disagree with. This is also something mentioned by other commenters, that Death Battle either doesn't use speed blitzes or being faster doesn't mean anything if you can't damage the opponent. The idea that Death Battle shouldn't use speed blitzes is really bizarre to me. Could you imagine if Death Battle had one character at multi-city block level and subsonic, but scales the other character to building level and faster than light, and somehow makes the multi-city block character win? That just doesn't seem right to me. Furthermore, people are also underestimating just how big a difference Death Battle's calculations were for Omni-Man and Bardock's speed. The gap for speed was 23,750 times in Bardock's favour. To put that number in perspective, the multiple gap between the speed of a lightning bolt and the speed of an average cow is less than the difference between the speed of Death Battle's Bardock and Omni-Man. Sure, you can hold the opinion that Omni-Man being 20 times stronger makes this a moot point. However, it's not as if Omni-Man is like hundreds or thousands of times more powerful than Bardock. If that were the case, I would at least understand the point, but Bardock is simply just so much more faster than Omni-Man is stronger than him. That said, I am aware this line of thinking could just be part of my own subconscious bias. You're free to explain in the comment section if I've misrepresented your point or just got something wrong. Now on to the third comment. This comment in specific interested me the most because it was made by someone who is apparently on the official Death Battle Discord server. I didn't expect my video to get any type of response from Death Battle, and I guess it still technically hasn't, but this is the closest I've had to an insight behind the scenes in the thought process. This comment comes from Toxin4998. Their first point is, one of the researchers had to say this about presuming the planets that King Vegeta destroys are Earth-sized. Then, quote, I will add the King Vegeta's feat, being impressive as it is, presumes that all 3 planets destroyed are Earth-sized despite lack of evidence, end quote. Even assuming that they are Earth-sized, you could be lenient with Omni-Man's Sun Disk calc, which would either way put him higher. Whether the Sun Disk calc is valid in its logic is a whole other argument, however. It's interesting to hear that Death Battle did, as I suspected, assume the planets were smaller than the planet Earth for the purposes of the calculation, and only used the assumption that the planets were Earth-sized as a highball. This is something I also firmly disagree with. As I said in my initial video, the majority of the planets in our own solar system are bigger than the Earth is, much less the universe itself, which is further shown in universe with King Cold's quote that I mentioned. So the idea of taking a below mid-scale planet for scaling the planet's size as somehow being a highball seems a bit absurd to me. The Earth as a baseline seems quite reasonable to me. I suppose that this could be opinionated as well, since, as the commenter said, you can't objectively prove that they are Earth-sized. However, considering the extremely conservative lowballing that's being done here, to say that these planets are smaller than planets that aren't even in the middle of the pack for planet sizes and calling it a highball is just a bit much for me. I think that's a bit unfair. Perhaps that is my bias talking, but if the high-end scaling for Omni-Man is just as concrete as it is for Bardock, then I would also like to see that, because giving Bardock the supposed leeway of the planets being the size of the Earth isn't a highball to me. And just because Omni-Man has a highball, it doesn't mean that his higher scaling is equally as valid as Bardock's. The second point made is, a common thing across Death Battle episodes, as well as reasoning within parts of the community, is that since the outcome is based on considering all possibilities and assuming the winner who would win more times than not, since Bardock would be massively weaker than Omni-Man, no matter how many multipliers he has, with him being massively faster, being able to speed blitz Omni-Man and chip him away, it's a lot less likely than Omni-Man simply landing a single hit and not on Bardock eventually. Omni-Man's higher stamina advantage would mean that Bardock would be getting weaker and more tired as the fight goes on, letting Omni-Man land a hit. This, again, in my opinion, falls under the same response I gave to the previous comment. If you think a 20 times difference is supposedly massive, then I wonder what you think about a 20,000 times difference. I'm just not convinced by that in most scenarios. Omni-Man would be lucky to get a hit on someone who is moving faster than a lightning bolt is to an average cow. Not to mention that even while Bardock will be getting slower, it's not as if him getting slower would make him at all on the same level as Omni-Man. You'd have to argue that he would get tens of thousands of times slower for Omni-Man to be able to hit him. But if this is what Death Battle was arguing in the video itself, then I would ask them to make that argument, because as far as I could glean from the video itself, that didn't really come across. The third point this commenter makes is, I agree on them having a bias, even if other people annoyingly assume that Death Battle has a negative bias towards Dragon Ball, or that Death Battle are complete Omni-Man bootlickers or whatever, but it's more so you have different lines of logic compared to whatever was the common consensus in the community. If you have questions regarding their line of logic, I'd recommend going to the official Discord server and asking there, but I do think they should have explained their logic better in the episode itself regardless. This I generally agree with, and I do think it would be cool to go on their official Discord server, as much as it would require me to pay, as much as I know. Although, not to suddenly make this a pity me party, but my social anxiety won't let me go into a server of a fan base, which I have publicly criticised their series for, at least knowing the internet and how people can be. The next point we have is also one we come to an agreement on, where Toxin says, I agree with this for the most part, but I will say they did also lowball Deku significantly for this episode. They only used the Mach feat for this episode, but Deku does have easy ways to get into relativistic speed in base, which Gear Shift would further stack on top of that, as it would just make the fight seem more fair. The main reason I bring up this specific point, despite agreeing with this, is also to tackle a really common comment that I got in the video itself, where there were people, understandably, a lot of them, upset of how Death Battle scales characters, not just with internal consistency, but generally speaking. If I made a video outlining every single time I disagreed with how Death Battle scaled characters, it would be 100 times longer than the previous video I made. It's rarer for me to agree with the levels of power and speed Death Battle scaled characters to than it is for me to disagree. but that isn't a big deal to me anymore. As I've been making power scaling content for years, my opinions about particular scaling drastically change, even within just a few months. Unless it's something that's particularly egregious, I'm not going to take particular issue with Death Battle scaling characters a certain way that otherwise I wouldn't, because that would just be miserable to constantly be complaining about an opinion which can easily change and is centered around fiction. Internal consistency is something I care far more about, because it's separate from wherever you scale a character from. You can change your mind on how you scale a character, but the idea that character A is stronger than character B under scaling that you used at the time isn't a bad thing. The next couple points that are outlined are similar to ones I mentioned previously, with Spawn and Simone being able to regenerate from damage infinitely above them. So the next point I'm going to focus on is something else that they said that was also parroted in the comment section by other people, which goes as follows. Well, the thing is, we've seen Simone jump multiple dimensions in power with relative ease. He should theoretically be able to keep going if you believe in his cosmology is theoretically smaller. Since Simone's cosmology can get as high as Outer because of the whole absorbing the author version of himself, I personally don't think that matters anyway, especially given that Kyle isn't killing Simone through physical power enemies. This is something else I also have a problem with, because while yes, we have seen Simone jump up multiple dimensions in power with ease, I'm not necessarily convinced he could continue to keep rising up in power to a seemingly infinite degree, as he only went through a finite amount of dimensions. This isn't exactly what the point that the comment was making, but if Kyle, say, scaled to 500 dimensional or something, would that argument for Simone surpassing Kyle still apply? This is why I called it a no limits fallacy, because it's a point where you're trying to say that Simone could do something infinitely beyond something that he's been shown to do, based on something that he did to a lesser extent. Also, the outer-versal Simone scaling just doesn't really apply to the video, since, well, Death Battle did bring up that specific statement, and this commenter did say that this could scale Simone to outer. They didn't scale him that way. If Death Battle did use to scale Simone to outer-versal, then we would be having a different conversation, and the closest I can see Death Battle in this episode itself to scaling Simone to outer-versal is saying that Gurren Lagann's cosmology could be considered bigger, but DC's would still be bigger given the same leeway. And the rest of the main points of the comment are also things I've addressed earlier in this video. The last thing that Toxin mentions is that they agree that it wouldn't be a bad idea for Death Battle to show the research in calcs publicly. Although Toxin does seem to contradict themselves by following the statement up with, I think G1 blogs do genuinely fill this role pretty well to a degree. There may be some things the blogs end up being wrong about as of the Kickstarter error, but they are basically the go-to place for coverage of everything. The G1 blogs aren't associated with Death Battle as far as I'm aware, and as Toxin says, the results of the blogs can end up differing from Death Battle episodes themselves, so while they are entertaining and a useful source and really well put together by talented people, it's not as if Death Battle themselves are using it. But for the sake of argument, if they did use the G1 blogs as the same thing as Death Battle scaling and thought processes, then I'd simply ask them to share that on each episode like I suggested. All in all, I do appreciate the time that people took out of their day to seriously give long-winded and respectful critiques, as I did to Death Battle. And as much as I say that Death Battle has biases, I also realise that I have my own biases, so seeing alternate points of view is a healthy way and is also just a net positive. There are of course some comments I didn't respond to directly because they either fall under the responses I've already given here, or they just are not worth replying to. But this will likely be where the content loop ends, and I look forward to getting back to regular power scaling videos as usual.